So we're not going to be able to get that deep on these folks tonight. We're just going to try to give you a little more information. And I liked it very much. A month or so ago, we had Holly Kamanzian and talk about lumber heritage. And so I just want everybody to be super clear. Like, no one here is saying we know everything and we are the experts. We're just really trying to get more information out there. Okay. So a lot of us know that a lot of bucktail history actually starts with E.A. Irvin, and we know that the Irvin family came into Curwensville. The Irvin family, actually, if you were a PBS watcher, you probably just saw that there was a big special. They just placed a state marker at Center Hall because it was actually through this line of the Irvins that had a farm there in Center Hall, and they actually donated 200 acres of land. That was the beginning of the Pennsylvania Farmers High School. And so that is the same line of Irvins, of course, who made a lot of money in the iron forges in the Center Hall area, and then of course came to Curwensville. So we also know that when these Irvins came to Curwensville, of course, they, set up, we had the big mill, if you know where Lesser Lumber is today in Curwensville, kind of along the river, across the road from River Street. They had the big mill, and the Irvins did a lot of, they had a mercantile store, they had a mill, a grist mill basically, and we know that they also had farms. And so they definitely came to Curwensville. They brought wealth with them, and therefore they were able to, they had purchased the land, and they were able to come here and to diversify people. So we know that EA was basically running the lumber business for his family, and when Abraham Lincoln called out for 75,000 volunteers from Pennsylvania, EA immediately got up a contingent of guys from Curwensville. All right, so we just tried to nail down some of the bigger events that occurred with EA in his life. And so we're looking at May 1861. There was a big picnic and basically kind of a party on the lawn of the Irvin home before they left. And of course, so that would be in Hildred and Carolyn's side yard and on their side porch. And so some of the men camped out, and literally in the morning, they got up. They had been given, the blessings of the town, and Mrs. Jane Patton Irvin had made the regimental flag, and of course presented that to them as they left. All right, so I know that everyone here already knows this, but they left Curwensville. They literally marched up what I always think of as across the Hogback Bridge, the Dimeling Bridge, and eventually made their way to Tyrone. When they got to Tyrone, so many Curwensville guys were there that there was not room for them on the train. And so they put out that if you're married, if you have kids, like some of the guys had to actually march the whole way back home, get money, and then pay their own way to get down to Harrisburg and Camp Curtin. So we know that, now obviously, like we said, we can't give every single, play-by-play of what EA actually did, but here's just some basics. So Mechanicsville battle commenced. Company K remained in the swamp. They were determined not to surrender. When the skirmish came about, Hartshorn was severely wounded in the head. Captain Irvin and Lieutenant Bard and Dale were captured. And so we know that that was from June to July in 1862. That was the first time that we know that EA was captured. We also understand that his mother did talk to Abraham Lincoln about getting him exchanged. Continuing on. So, September 1862, he was struck in the head in the Battle of South Mountain, which is right below Fredericksburg, Maryland. That that same year, a little bit later, December 1862, the Bucktails were at the Battle of Fredericksburg, returned to action, and again, E.A. was again wounded. He was then discharged. He was deemed to not be physically capable of carrying on, and the surgeon had deemed that he was not able. Of course, we know that many things happened. We know that E.A. actually was in the United States Assembly, or excuse me, the Pennsylvania State General Assembly. We know that he was actually a school board director for a time period. So he did a lot of great things. When he came back from the war, he gave back to the town. We know that where the Doughboy Monument, now the World War II Monument, and of course in the back, the Bucktail Monument, we know that E.A. was the one who gave that land to the people of Curwensville, i.e. the borough, for a Bucktail Monument to be built there. And so, of course, we also know that all that paperwork kind of got lost in the mix somewhere. And so it's a big credit, I feel like, to Ed Morgan, who, when we were planning our bicentennial here in Curwensville, he did a lot of digging around and a lot of research while he was actually writing a Bucktail book. And he was the one who found out that Curwensville had basically not done what this land was supposed to be used for. And so that's when the black granite marker in Curwensville was actually put there. However, E.A. was also instrumental in getting, up at Driftwood, there is a Bucktail Monument. I'm sure you all have seen that. Obviously, also the Bucktail Monument down in Gettysburg. And so we know that E.A. did an awful lot, not just with monuments, but also reunions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so he gave back to the community, but he also was very supportive of his Bucktail comrades. So, all right, we know that it was actually his dad, William, who gave the first chunk of the land to Curwensville for Oak Hill Cemetery. And so, in Oak Hill Cemetery, of course, has the honor of that there are more Bucktails buried in Oak Hill Cemetery than any place else other than Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Okay, so we want to talk about it. I almost feel like it's like a lineup. It's like a mugshot or something. And so I'm going to talk about several of these folks. We know that. Let's start over on the far side with Cyrus Lauer. Cyrus Lauer was not a Curwensville guy. And so we wish he was from Curwensville because he fit right in. But we do know that he was actually captured. He was on a train headed south to a southern prison. And he actually got up the gumption and jumped off the moving train. Was able to get somehow, if you've ever read his account that Ed Morgan wrote, he said he stopped not for bacon, he stopped not for something, and he just rolled down through the laurel bush, and he eventually got back to his regiment. And he said, when I reached in my pocket and pulled out my bucktail, my comrades just went wild with delight. And so for bravery and being able to get back to his regiment, he was actually awarded the Medal of Honor. As far as we know, the only Bucktail who actually was awarded the Medal of Honor. Our understanding is because one of his descendants actually spoke to Hildred and Carolyn, and we were told that the military lost his paperwork, and so he himself in his lifetime never actually received said Medal of Honor, but he has that distinction of being the only. So Alexander McDonald, there were actually 3 McDonald brothers from Grampian. They were farmers and also lumbermen. So a lot of times, and again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but you know that a lot of times in those days, you would farm in the summertime, and then in the wintertime when you can't be farming, of course you'd go into the woods and start, working in those logging camps. And so the McDonald brothers went off with the Bucktails, and we have actually, well, I think I put it back with Carolyn, but we were lucky enough to get copies because these three, you can imagine 3 brothers, and they just wrote, letters home, and then their families wrote back to them. And so, you have such a good firsthand account of what some of these battles were like. Alexander's one letter said he was talking about that they kind of were pinned down, and he said that the bullets were flying blue over their heads, and he said, it just sounded like a threshing machine from back on the farm. He said it was the dangest, ugliest noise he'd ever heard in his life. And so the McDonald brothers from Grampian area were able to have basically stick together and to survive. All right, so we know about James M. Welch. He was from Pike Township, so he was a local guide. He was said to be a big, tall gentleman, very much he was referred to as a Class A hewer of square timber. And so he was great at his field, or he was great at his job. And he also was, when he actually left the military, he worked in wrought iron metal and had contracts with the United States government. And so we feel like, when you're in Washington, D.C., some of the fencing that you see could potentially be, something that he did. We don't have EA up there, but we'll get back to him. So the Blooms, Enos Bloom. I don't know, do we have any Blooms in the audience? I don't know if anybody wants to raise their hand if you have any Bloom genealogy at all. Yes, you do, people. So we all do. If you've been around Curwensville, you have a little Bloom in you. And so we know that the Blooms actually, and Enos, of course, because Enos was also there with several other siblings, and he wrote an account, from his journal. And once again, this is a gift we have from Ed Morgan, where Ed talked about, Ed has his journal entry where he talks about fighting and kind of hunkering down, and their position actually was overrun, and how his brother was taken prisoner, but he was able to kind of hide out and escape and hold on. And he said that the one account I remember, he wrote about 2 Confederates came up to him, he shot the one, the other said, you've got to surrender. He told him he will surrender, but when the Confederate gets ready to take him captive, he shoots the Confederate. And so he said, he survived this little skirmish and was able to get back with his comrades. J. Elliott Kratzer. We know that Kratzer, of course, in Curwensville is a big name. And so there were 3 Kratzer brothers. And so this is J. Elliott, and he was able to survive the Civil War. And he actually was a person who came back to Curwensville, eventually, though, did some traveling. And one of his claims to fame was that they believe that he was the second white man to survive the Bitterroot Trail out west. He did come back to Curwensville later on to retire and is buried here. Sadly, Elliott also had 2 other brothers, however. Both of them were killed during the war. One was killed and buried at Chancellorsville. The other brother was buried at Bull Run. And so the Kratzer, Rachel Kratzer, their mother, obviously sent off 3 sons to the Civil War. Only one of her sons survived. Okay. William Ross Hartshorn. He was a military leader of the Bucktails. He spent time with, if you've ever, because I teach a local history class here at the school. And so I always try to say to the kids, so you know how if you ever go to the beach and you're going down to Virginia Beach or you're going to the Outer Banks or whatever, you're on 95 South. When you're going down 95 South in Lower Virginia, you see all these signs with Chickahominy swamps. And so you know, if you've ever had a chance, I got to go back there and drive around and take a look around. And our Curwensville Bucktail guys were trapped in the Chickahominy swamps for days, had nothing to eat. And we know that most of them were in fact at some point captured, and that Mr. William Ross Hartshorn was there. We know that he also did survive the war. He actually was, for a time period, worked for the governor of Pennsylvania. So he did a lot of cool things after he returned. So, okay. Let's just keep going, shall we? And let's go to John Norris. And you probably, are there any Norrises here or Norris relatives? Okay, thanks. So, Curwensville here had a former teacher. Do you need me to do something?
Nope, I just had that frozen up there. It's fine.
Okay. Okay, so once again, John Norris was a local person. He also had numerous siblings that went into the war. John did survive the war and kind of became a leader of the older folks after they had retired. They had survived the battles and came back to Curwensville. And we have a couple pictures of him as an older gentleman. It's a pretty interesting. He has a pretty interesting story to tell. So I wouldn't be so bold as to say saving the best for last, but this is actually my ancestor. His name was James Glenn, and so he was actually from New Melport. Actually, my cousin Bill Matlack actually lives in the house that he grew up in, and he was older and had 6 kids actually. So when they all marched down to Tyrone, he was one of the guys that got turned back. He had to go back home, scratch up some money, and pay his own way to go down to Harrisburg to Camp Curtin. So sadly for James, he didn't spend too awful much time with the Army. At the very first battle that the actual battle that the Bucktails engaged in, which was in Drainesville, he actually sustained a wound and had to have his leg amputated. And so I have read that there's a belief that he was one of the first amputees of the Army of the Potomac. So, but we do have later pictures of him. He survived the war, he survived his wound, and in one of the books it wrote about how he said he would not trade the experience that he had, even though, of course, obviously, coming back with a disability. And just as a fun fact, so if you ever go down to Gettysburg, you can actually go, how they have some of those really cool stores, and you can actually tell them, like, what regiment your person was in, and this is, obviously, I treasure this, and because this is the cap that he would have worn. So I also want to just take a 10-second pause here and also mention, so obviously my relative, went off to war and got severely injured and had a leg amputated. But just for 10 seconds, I mean, think about his wife back home up on the farm in Melport, 6 kids, and trying to, keep 6 kids going and trying to keep the farm going and keep feeding your kids. So I feel like that's also kind of an important thing to talk about. Okay, Elliot Kratzer, we talked about. This is just a couple more details. So he was wounded at Gettysburg. He re-enlisted and served on General Hartshorn's staff throughout the remainder of the war. His brothers John and William were killed at Second Bull Run in Chancellorsville. Oops, I'm sorry, I went backwards. Brigadier General William Roth Hartshorn. He was the highest-ranking officer from Clearfield County during the war. Following Gettysburg, he assumed command of the Bucktails and remained their leader throughout the end of their service until they mustered out. I keep going backwards, and I don't know why. Okay, so Elijah Only. So this is a story that, and obviously I want everybody to be pretty clear. Like, I totally know that as I'm sitting here talking to you, like, I know that Mr. Ricker could do a much better job. So I'm just kind of like the introduction person. And if you come back on April 8th, we'll get more details from Mr. Rickard. So this is the story that's been passed down. keep in mind when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, those southern slaveholding states did not automatically say, hey, well, okay, you slaves are all free now because Abraham Lincoln up north said you are. That's not how it worked. So basically during as the northern troops make their way through these different, southern states and the plantations and the farms, and so a lot of times they are the ones who are literally like explaining to these African Americans about what exactly is happening. Well, obviously, a lot of these folks are people who have been slaves their whole entire life. So a lot of times they didn't really have much of an idea of what they should actually do. Like, how are they going to feed themselves and support themselves? They hadn't had the chance to try that. And so some of them would actually come along, they would follow along after the northern troops. Sometimes they were referred to as contraband and such. And so this particular gentleman came along with Company K and E.A. Irvin. And so he basically became E.A.'s kind of personal servant that E.A., paid and helped out quite a bit. So this is almost it's one of those stories that you hear about. So the Curwensville guys, literally, you've probably seen this in movies, but a lot of times before a battle, they would literally, they didn't have cell phones to text mom and say, hey mom, I think we're going to go to battle tomorrow, I'm really upset, here's what I want you to know. So a lot of times they would write letters and give them to somebody in case they didn't come back. They would also make sure they got their name, stitch their name if they could into their jacket so people would know who they were. So EA becomes the guy that when the guys are getting ready to go out and have a battle, they would actually give their important possessions to him and ask him to hold on to them and keep them safe. And also that if they didn't come back, to make sure that their letters and things got to their loved ones here in Curwensville. So, and the name, of course, comes from the guys when they're first talking to Elijah. They say, well, what's your name? And he said, Elijah. And they said, well, what's your last name? And he said, I don't have a last name, it's Elijah only. And so that's how he got the name of Elijah only. And so this is actually up in Oak Hill Cemetery. Looking at the funeral of Ross Hartshorn. And he came here, he worked for the Irvins, he did numerous jobs. However, as happens, I think, so many times in history, he actually met a woman from Osceola. And he married this woman and moved to Osceola. And he's actually buried over somewhere in Osceola, which is kind of a cool story. Private Alexander McDonald. This is the same guy that was on the original picture. The group picture is just a different picture of the same man. And so again, he was one of three McDonald brothers, members of Company K. He was captured twice and wounded. He was held in high regard for his time. He served until an honorable discharge in June of 1865. This is a later shot of Corporal Cyrus Benson Lauer, a Medal of Honor recipient for his actions at the Battle of Wilderness and also for his ability to escape. He's buried at Arlington Cemetery following his death in 1924. And once again, sometimes I think it's interesting that we think about, that some of these folks lived, into the 1900s. And so the Civil War really was not, my mom's 88 and she was born in 1935. And so this generation really is not that far removed from us. Private Enos Bloom, wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864. He's buried at the New Millport Cemetery. Captain John H. Norris. Again, I remember we talked about a skilled lumberman and craftsman. After the war, he had iron fencing in Washington, D.C. I don't know why it keeps clicking backwards, but it does. That's my relative. Correct. And this is, actually, today we were talking amongst our little group, because there are some things that are pretty complicated about, names and facts about some of these guys. So, not in the same regiment, but within the Bucktails, there were actually two James Glens. My ancestor was a private, but there was another ancestor actually who was an officer in the Bucktails. A little bit complicated. Captain James Welch from Pike Township captured the Battle of Mechanicsburg, suffered a gunshot wound to the left lung in Antietam. He married Mary Ellen Mason of Curwensville and moved to Topeka, Kansas to farm. All right, so this is also a little bit of a contentious idea here, and I'll show you and tell you why. So everyone I'm sure knows about Colonel John. He followed his cousin E.A. and commissioned the new Bucktails Company B, who sadly for them, until, of course, the fighting at Gettysburg, you know, remember that the second group of Bucktails from Curwensville were nicknamed the bogus Bucktails. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine that these original Bucktails who had been through hell, excuse my language, you know, and now you have all these new recruits calling themselves Bucktails. And so the Company K guys, the original guys, weren't necessarily happy. So E.A.'s cousin, John, also then, after the first year of the war, decides to bring up another group of men from Curwensville. So this part of the family had a mercantile and other businesses. He, of course, before the war had started, he started building the stone manor for his fiancée. Suffered many great losses among his men. He also was injured at Gettysburg. So he suffered a severe. So here is what we're looking at right now today. Here's what and I'm just going to be very honest with you, because our goal here is to get as much information as we can and get the best information. So this is the picture. So I talked to you about how Ed Morgan, I'm really lucky because before he passed, he gave me a lot of his information on the Bucktails. This is the picture that Ed gave me. However, this is also a picture of John Irvin. And so here's what we found. So this is so bizarre, like, you know. So there was a guy from Clearfield his name was John Irwin. And so we think that that's where this confusion comes from, that this is the John Irwin who went in through Clearfield, and that our Curwensville John Irvin is that gentleman. So, okay, and you believe that that is correct?
I know for a fact. That's first one was Lieutenant John F. Irwin,
okay,
who was under John Irvin. He was the lieutenant under captain, and that was a source of continued.
Yes.
Because John Irvin then was promoted to major, which meant that John F. Irwin became captain of Company B, and they would joke about that. They said, you know, if we get into trouble, we'll use your name.
Right.
But they were cousins.
Okay. Oh, they were cousins. So the Irwin and the Irvins were cousins. Okay, because let me just show you this very quickly. Because in this book, and I mean, everybody, I'm sure lots of you have this book. So in this book, and it's an inexpensive book, so it has to be pretty real. It's like the internet. So in this book, they show this man as our John Irvin. So it is a mistake in this book, which is a very expensive book.
Yeah, it's also a mistake in the 149.
The Bard.
No.
Oh.
He was in the 149.
Okay.
The regimental is by Matthews, and they have them mixed up.
Okay, so this is something that, actually it makes us feel a little bit better, but, you know, because that's kind of a...
The way you can tell is he's a lieutenant.
Okay.
Irvin was never a lieutenant. He started out as a captain.
Okay.
That's his lieutenant.
Okay. Thank you for putting that to rest. We have a couple more questions from people too. Sadly, there's some confusing things.
You don't know John Irwin's birth date, death date, wife's name? Because I have a John Irwin in my line about that time, from Clearfield.
Okay, and that's probably him. You want to just take a look at this.
Oh.
So he was a Quaker. And so that book, he didn't write it himself. His family members after his demise, wrote that. So take a look at that and see if that's your guy. Okay, we're going to talk now about John Irvin and his timeline. So we know that summer of 1862, he is the person who helped to form Company B, the Company B regiment of the 149th Pennsylvania Bucktails. From 1862 to 63, they were not necessarily heavily involved in the action. They spent much of their time as guards at Gettysburg. However, obviously you know what's coming. In July of 1863, at the Battle of Gettysburg, many men suffered losses and wounds. John Irvin himself was wounded in the head. Nearly 75% of the 149th Regiment was killed, wounded, or MIA. And that is the regiment of guys they talk about when they talk about the regiment that suffered the highest numerical battlefield losses at the Battle of Gettysburg. And so that's why we say that when the original Bucktails kind of poo-pooed or, kind of didn't take seriously Company B, the later Bucktails, after the devastation that they experienced at Gettysburg, I don't think that that happened anymore. I think that they saw that they could pull their weight. All right, in 1864, he's promoted to major in February, promoted to lieutenant colonel in April, and he would later be promoted to colonel in February 1865. That does not mean to say 1783. I'm going to go with 1873. He hosted a Bucktail reunion, the first of many, in Curwensville at his home in 1893. There you go. It should be that's a 19. Okay. I read it as a 17. So we know that there were several Bucktail reunions held here in Curwensville. So I'm lucky enough to have, and I'm sure there's others of you that have these also. So this is the 1901 annual Bucktail reunion. This was actually held in Gettysburg. And of course it talks about all the, it's kind of like a program for the Bucktails when they got together. This one actually talks about my ancestor that James Glenn died at New Melport, age 74 years, Uncle Jim as the boys called him. He did attend many reunions until he passed. This is actually from the 1897 Bucktail reunion that was held in Smethport. But the same thing, so there's, they have a business meeting basically. They keep track of any of their comrades who had passed and where people were living at the time, which was kind of an interesting thing. All right, so a First Lieutenant Milton McClure, because obviously we know we still have McClures in Curwensville today. He worked as a farmer in Curwensville, suffered from severe ailments throughout the war. He had duty at Mount Pleasant Hospital in Washington, D.C. Captain John L. Rex was captured at Gettysburg, but he also commanded Company G in 1864. Okay, Lieutenant Albert Cole, and if you've been on any of our walking tours or anything, you know about Albert Cole. He's pretty near and dear to our hearts. An interesting story about Albert. So we know that Albert was, of course, a young, this is not, the picture beside him is actually Reverend Gardner. So Reverend Gardner, if you've ever been into the Curwensville Methodist Church, on one of their back walls, they literally have a picture of every single preacher they've ever had. And so this gentleman happened to be the preacher at the Curwensville Methodist Church when the Civil War breaks out. And so he is off to Chambers. He asks his congregation if he can have some time off. He actually rides down to Chambersburg to see one of his friends who's graduating from the seminary school there. And as he is there, he's just kind of that, he's in that place at that time. and a Union soldier rides up and asks for help to get this group of men to Gettysburg. And so Reverend Gardner, of course, helps him to do that. Once Gardner gets into Gettysburg, obviously the war's already been going. And so, of course, as a minister, I feel like probably felt like he could maybe try to give some comfort to some of the wounded. He goes into a barn and calls out. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you, and I know that you don't all know me very well, but this is just me. So he goes out and he goes into this barn of some severely wounded folks, and he calls out, "Are there any boys here from Clearfield?" He did not say, "Are there any boys here from Curwensville?" I'm sure he was trying to be like general area and so on and so forth. We're going with that. So yeah, somebody in the back of the barn like literally like says, "Here, I'm here." And so Albert Cole's family actually attended his church. But Albert was so wounded that Gardner did not recognize him, and he kind of had to ask him like, "Well, who's your dad?" And so it was a little bit of that. But the story goes that Reverend Gardner actually paid for him to be removed from the barn and to be nursed back to health. Sadly, we know that Albert Cole did in fact survive, but we also know that he re-enlisted, and we also know that he was in the area of Hatcher's Run, and he was shot not too awful long before, of course, the treaty was signed between Lee and Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And so Albert Cole is considered to be the last bucktail to die in the Civil War, from a wound, not from a disease or something like that, a physical ailment that way. And so the story of his family, if you ever get up to Oak Hill Cemetery, you can find his grave. If you ever have a chance to go, Hildred Rolls does walking tours of Curwensville twice a year, one in the spring and then of course one in the fall. But we always stop at Albert Cole's grave. So his mother had already lost 2 children. She lost a daughter to the flu, and then she had a toddler who of course was learning how to walk and pulled herself up to a big huge pail of water that was boiling to do the laundry, and was scalded and killed. And so this was her last. Albert Cole was her last surviving child. And so I think to show how strongly they felt, like when you get up to Oak Hill Cemetery and you find Albert Cole's grave, make sure you read the inscription that his mother put onto to his tombstone. And so we do not have, and that's another one of those things, we don't have a picture of Albert Cole. If anybody here has a picture of Albert Cole, that would be just something really amazing for us to be able to find, and maybe it's out there somewhere, but obviously an American hero. Okay, so the Bucktail Monument. So our Historical Society, again, got the information from Ed Morgan that we needed to put up a Bucktail Monument because that's what Ed gave that land for. And obviously, you know how anytime you try to do something, you're going to have people who want this or they want this or something like that. And so there was a lot of contention about like what should the marker look like. And so obviously this is the image that we came up with, the idea of the old campaigner, and that is what a lot of our bucktail guys would have looked like during the war. So you know that when you go up to the monument, I'm sure most of you have already been there, but when you get a chance to go up, remember that initially you have Company K, and of course the second group, of course, are Company B, and that's how you can tell, of course, which regiment these folks were in. It's a beautiful, beautiful monument. Okay, so this is a monument, of course, to the Bucktails in Gettysburg as you're coming down the Chambersburg Pike. It's actually, like, if you start the battlefield tour right there, it's actually pretty early on, which I think is a significant, I would say, kind of a bow to the Bucktails is how I feel about it. Okay, and we are done. All right, at this time, does anybody have a story they want to share about someone that you know about, or an ancestor or something? Go ahead, Terry.
Well, one of my favorites is Ross Hartshorn. People don't appreciate him here in town.
Would you mind standing up? Do you mind, or do you want to?
Well, I can stand up.
Okay, thanks.
Just make sure I sit down.
Okay,
But
okay, we'll put him on the clock, okay.
he was the adjutant of the Bucktail Regiment. So he was in the staff, moved up from a lieutenant in Company K. The Battle of Antietam, the colonel and the lieutenant colonel were both out of action. So who commanded at Antietam? Ross Hartshorn. The Colonel, Hugh McNeil's last words were, "Forward, Bucktails, forward." And basically what they said, they started the ball. You'll always read that the Battle of Antietam started on the 17th of September, 1862. For them, it was the evening of the 16th. They took heavy losses and they lost their colonel. But anyhow, Ross Hartshorn took over. But he's the adjutant. He's a major. They elected a new colonel. So Ross Hartshorn goes back to his adjutant job. At Gettysburg, the new colonel was Charles Frederick Taylor, Fred Taylor. And Fred Taylor was the youngest colonel in the history of the Union Army. He was only 23, but he was very well liked. During the charge down off Little Round Top, the Bucktails made, Allenson Niles, the lieutenant colonel, was wounded and never did come back, and Charlie Taylor was killed. Ross Hartshorn was in command at Gettysburg. The men all wanted Ross to remain as their commander. He's still a major. I won't get into the politics, but he had a major run-in with Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania, and basically Curtin said he will never, ever hold anything in the way of rank above what he already has. Well, Ross stayed in. When his time came to pay off, he became full colonel in the new 190th Pennsylvania Veteran Volunteers. And that's where the men who re-enlisted ended up. You didn't re-enlist into your unit. You just re-enlisted into a new unit, the 149 or the 190th, all elite. 2 full companies of former Bucktails, almost all the men that were left of the regiment. But anyhow, they had hard luck. They were outflanked in the Battle of Quaker Road, and 2 new brigades fell back. The Bucktails and the brigade they were in were captured and went to Andersonville. Well, there was a major political problem when a U.S. Navy ship stopped a British ship, British cargo ship or passenger ship, and took a couple of Confederate commissioners prisoner. Well, as prisoners, they were being threatened with being hung. So what's the South do? They picked 2 of the most prominent men at Andersonville, the son of a current senator, U.S. senator, and the Bucktail colonel, Ross Hartshorn. They took him to Libby Prison. In the basement, they dug a dungeon. It was about 12 feet deep and about 6 or 7 feet wide. Chained these 2 men together and dropped them down and put a grate across it. Well, there was an awful lot of tension, and basically the South said, "You hang our commissioners, we hang our prisoners." Well, as it turned out, Lincoln finally got involved in this and said, this is ridiculous. Turn the two commissioners loose. Let these two Confederate prisoners out. So when they pulled the grate off, and this was after many, many weeks, they drug out the two men. The senator's son was dead. Ross Hartshorn was about 80 pounds. Lincoln, who had this right, promoted Ross Hartshorn to a brevet brigadier general, and that's where he got the rank. After he recovered, he was made inspector general of the 5th Corps. And even after the war, he was very prominent in the government. That's how he got his brevet to brigadier general. And I think that's just a fascinating story of what he actually did. So.
Thanks, Terry. Anybody else? Let's see if I can get it. Just give me a minute. Let me see if I can get my camera working so we can show some more pictures. Okay, Glenna, we might have to just show your pictures like this. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I will hold them.
I have just a little bit on it. He's actually not a Curwensville boy, he's a Clarion boy. But to give you a little bit of information of why I think he's kind of relevant to here, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. He was born in 1838 in Clarion County, but he married a girl from Clearfield County in 1868, which that is their wedding picture, John Calvin Geyer and Mary Walburn. They had their first child that same year, who was born in Hibernia, but after that he moved back to Clarion and was a farmer there. He was still in Clarion in the 1880 census, but by the birth of a child in 1884, he was back in Penn Township. He had a total of 14 children, including, which for this time frame I think is pretty interesting, 2 sets of twins. I think during the 1880s, the chances of both of them surviving wasn't real high. And it was one of the sets of twins. There were 2 sets of girls, a set of girls and a set of boys. One of the girls was my great-grandmother. Some of the descendants of him, names that you would be familiar with, is Spencer, Rafferty, Dunworth, Lyons, Weber, Tubbs, Wall, Dunlap, McCracken, and Hepburn. might be shiny. That's a picture of, is it gonna show up? That's a picture of mostly his children and grandchildren. On the left, on the screen that's on the right, are him and his wife, and I think he might be cut off where you're at. Yeah, that's John Calvin and Mary. He passed away in 1917, so he also lived in the 1900s, and was buried at Friends Cemetery in Grampian. In, I think, 2006, at the Spencer Dyer reunion, a person in possession of his discharge papers brought them to the reunion. And I don't know that they were all, Mr. Rickert may know, were they all like that? It was a poster-sized, hand-painted, the back has, so that's kind of the
Usually
center.
provided by the state, yes.
It was beautiful. It was like a beautiful work of art. The center of it, just to tell you, now this is about his service, that center that has handwriting, I tried to translate as best I could. It's very difficult to read, but it says, "This is to certify that John C. Geyer enlisted September 7th, 1861 from Clarion County, PA, and was mustered into the United States service at Kittanning, PA, to serve 3 years as a private in Company A, 103rd Regiment, PA Volunteer Infantry under Captain R. Lockman and Colonel T.F. Lehman. The regiment was assigned to Keyes Corps, arriving at the Potomac, and Conrad Geyer shared the fortunes of his regiment in all its movements as follows. Siege, I'm not going to read the dates, but in these mostly were 1862. Siege of Yorktown in April, Williamsburg, May, Fair Oaks, May, Severe Days Battle, June to July, Malvern Hill in June. The regiment was then transferred to Butler Corps and engaged at Kinston in December of 62, Little Washington in December of 62, and then Plymouth, North Carolina, where Comrade Geyer and the whole regiment was captured. Comrade Geyer was taken to Andersonville, April 18th, 1864, held 5 months, then taken to Charleston, South Carolina, and held 1 month, then to Florence and held 4 months, after which he was paroled and taken to Annapolis, where he was honorably discharged by GO number 77 and close of the war. Re-enlisted as a veteran January 1st, 1864, member of Wilson Caldwell PAX is what it looks like on the certificate. His regiment lost 3 officers and 50 enlisted men by mortal wounds, and then 1 officer and 352 men due to disease, which I'm thinking that maybe some of them were at Andersonville. And just as a little mini history lesson, the 14 months between February 64 and March 65, Anderson saw nearly 45,000 Union soldiers pass through the gates. 13,000 did not survive. The prison commandant, Captain Wurz, was arrested by the federal government and became the only person on either side of the war to be executed after the Civil War for war crimes. This was due to his deplorable and cruel treatment to the soldiers held there. He was, as a result of his trial, he was hanged, but his neck did not break, and supposedly the soldiers cheered as he suffocated to death. So, and that's it. And he wasn't a Curwensville boy, but he became a Grampian boy, and many of his descendants are still in the Grampian area. He also, there's a picture that Carolyn found that's of one of the reunions that he identified on that picture that's back on the table.
Sure. Okay, do we have anybody else who would like to share? Carolyn, come on up.
Well, I'm not going to come up if that's okay.
Okay.
Just a couple things. We have a couple tables here of items from the museum, and at the one end, I made some copies of a couple bibliographies. One was from our first speaker in the series. And then one is a 2-page bibliography that we've had for quite a while up at the museum, but I'm sure there's still some valid sources there that you might enjoy having a copy. They're free of charge. Excuse me. Also a copy of a poem called The Little Green Tents that John Norris had printed for one of the reunions. We've offered that several times here, and people seem to like to take that home with them. And then I am working on transcribing. Many of you know that we were gifted with an enormous amount of correspondence from Curwensville Bank. And that has been my work for many, many years. And I am currently transcribing letters from a lumberman in Williamsport named Albert Cole Hopkins. I was reading one of his letters this week, and then I copied it for all of you who might be interested in reading it. And as I'm typing it out, the very last paragraph of the letter, which I thought was kind of, I don't know, not creepy, but wild, that it came out this week. It's Albert Hopkins writes this to John Patton, who lived where Beardsley's funeral home is, and he says, "Have this moment, 8:45 a.m., learned of death of General Grant. He was great to the end." And so that's kind of a nice little footnote to our, but you're welcome to come and look. We have some interesting pieces, certainly not our entire collection at all. And also I want to add that I had an uncle in the war, Cortez Bloom, and he made it through the war. He was discharged in 1863 because he was wounded, and then he drowned in a horrific lumber logging accident down near Sunbury in 1867. It took them a month to find him. So, yes, that's just come to light. But if you'd like copies of any of these, you're welcome to help yourself.
Thank you. Well, listen, we'd also like to welcome you to come back on April the 8th. We're going to have kind of a little question and answer session. So if you have questions, please write down your questions and bring them with you. That's April the 8th, a Monday night, 6 o'clock. And we are hoping that Terry Rickard will answer some of our questions. Okay? Thanks everyone for coming tonight. We very much appreciate your support. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I've got the local disease, you know, whatever it is, the disease of the moment. So, trying to just back up a little bit.
My great-great-grandfather was in the Civil War, but he wasn't
From this area.
Yeah, he was from Clairville or Woodland area.